How does someone buy a genuine Apollo lunar module for just $7,000? Because this gold foil-wrapped moon lander everyone pictures on the lunar surface ended up in a dusty studio warehouse, sold off as a forgotten movie prop. But when Joshua peeled back the serial plate, it turned out to be a flight-ready backup, written off and hidden for decades. I'm going to show you the whole story, the restoration, and the shocking documents that proved it was real. Note, the following is a summary of the fictional premise provided, treated as entertainment. No verifiable real-world sources exist for this specific event. Details are drawn from the narrative pitch. Hook type: rhetorical question plus immediate importance assertion. Rehook cadence: asterisk every 40-60 seconds via shocking statistic. Analogy: ball colors pizza. Debt escalation $10,000 turning into millions, and direct address. Has what I've told you made sense so far? Narrative structure asterisk Act 1. The dire state of money management, 69% don't save. Act 2. Three mentalities: poor, middle class, rich, and the cycle of liabilities versus assets. Act 3. The pizza budget model and early investment payoff. Tone profile: direct, urgent, teacher to student. Shifts between conspiratorial, people hate to look humbler, serious, debt warnings, and motivational investment, compound growth. Heavy use of analogies and visual metaphors. Meet Joshua, a restoration expert who hunts forgotten relics. When he found a movie prop in a closing studio lot, he almost walked away. But behind that crinkled gold foil wasn't a replica. It was a flight-ready backup Apollo lander that NASA had written off. This is the story of an ordinary workshop turned ground zero for an extraordinary discovery. Joshua first saw it buried in the back of a shuttered film studio, wedged between broken lights and a dusty mock-up of a news desk. Linda, the facility owner, was clearing out decades of forgotten movie props. The lunar lander stood there, its crinkled gold legs catching the last afternoon light through a grimy window. She called it a model from an old sci-fi shoot, tagged it at $7,000, and just wanted it gone. Joshua ran his hand over the foil. It wasn't painted aluminum. It felt like Captain, the same thermal insulation NASA used on the actual Apollo missions. That made no sense. Movie replicas never use flight-grade materials. He paid her on the spot, strapped the spindly descent stage onto a flatbed, and drove it 3 hours back to his workshop. The first night, he barely slept. He pulled back a torn corner of the gold wrapping and saw a manufacturer's plate he hadn't noticed at the warehouse. Grumman Aerospace, Long Island. Serial number LM-14-X with a test date stamp from 1969. This wasn't some Hollywood prop. It was something else entirely. Joshua called a number he hadn't dialed in years. Kenneth, a retired NASA engineer who'd worked on the original lunar module assembly line. He sent photos of the data plate and the foil. The reply came in under 5 minutes, 3 words. "Where did you get this?" Joshua stared at the screen. The full story was about to break wide open. Kenneth drove 12 hours straight, pulling into Joshua's workshop a little past dawn. He hadn't slept either. He walked up to the spidery gold lander and just stood there, running his palm over the Captain foil like he was touching his own youth. Then he knelt by the descent engine bell, squinted at a partially obscured stamp, and his voice cracked. "This is real. This is the real thing." He ran a thumb over the Grumman data plate Joshua had photographed. LM-14-X didn't just exist on paper. Kenneth remembered it from a classified inventory list he hadn't seen since 1971. The official log said it had been scrapped after the program ended. Yet here it stood, wrapped in thermal foil, its spherical fuel tank still pressurized with inert gas. A ghost from the race to the moon. But Kenneth's face tightened. He pointed to a small bracket near the top of the descent stage, a fitting designed to hold a pyrotechnic separation ring. Ground test articles, the ones that never flew, never received that bracket. It was only added right before a vehicle was declared flight-ready. Joshua felt the weight of that detail. They weren't looking at a simulator. They were looking at a machine built to carry astronauts. The next 3 weeks became a meticulous restoration. Joshua's small team peeled back the damaged foil layer by layer, bagging each piece for chemical analysis. They reversed engineered the original Captain tape, sourced the exact aluminized film from a supplier that once served the Apollo program, and spent afternoons rewrapping the lander's legs inch by inch. The gold took on a fresh luster that almost hurt to look at. Then Kenneth found the discrepancy that opened up the whole mystery. He was examining the wiring harness when he spotted a modification tag dangling from the main engine relay. It was a handwritten note on brittle yellow paper, sealed inside a plastic sleeve, with the initials TDK and a date, April 10th, 1972. TDK was Thomas David Kelly, a senior propulsion engineer who had signed off on the final flight readiness of the actual Apollo lunar modules. That tag had no business being on a vehicle marked as scrapped. Kenneth called a former colleague at the Smithsonian. Within 48 hours, a digitized microfilm file arrived. It showed a quiet administrative transfer in late 1972, LM-14-X, designated as a contingency flight backup, was declared surplus and earmarked for disposition by neglect. The phrase chilled Joshua. Someone had deliberately let this lander slip through the cracks, not as a mistake, as a silent preservation. But for what? The lander's instrument panel still held a locked compartment that Joshua had been too cautious to force open. Kenneth held his gaze. Whatever they didn't want found is in there. Joshua fetched a surgical drill. The bit touched the latch. The drill whined and the latch gave way. Inside the compartment sat a single manila envelope, yellow and brittle. Joshua opened it carefully. Out slid a stack of NASA transfer forms, a mission patch for Apollo 19, and a handwritten letter. The letter was from Thomas David Kelly, the propulsion engineer whose initials Kenneth had spotted. It read, "This vehicle is not to be destroyed. It is the last complete LM. One day, someone will need to know what we built. TDK, April 14, 1972. Kenneth's eyes welled up. Apollo 19 was the final lunar landing mission, canceled in 1970 when Congress pulled funding. Every flight-ready module had been ordered scrapped or museum stripped. Yet here was a fully intact lander, its guidance computer still bolted into the panel, its ascent stage oxygen tank still sealed. The official record said it was gone. Kelly and a handful of other engineers had lied on the paperwork. They let it slip into a studio warehouse under a fake property tag, hoping it would survive the bureaucratic purge. But the document folder held another surprise. A fuel load manifest, dated October 19, 1972, indicated that the descent engine had been partially loaded with hypergolic propellant for a static test that was never run. The tanks had been purged, but the fuel lines were still coated with residue. That meant the engine wasn't just structurally sound, it might still be capable of ignition. Joshua's team gathered around the engine bell. Kenneth pointed to the injector plate, a delicate shower head that sprays fuel and oxidizer together at the point of ignition. It was clean, uncorroded. "If we can flow modern fuel through it," Kenneth said, "we can prove this lander wasn't a museum piece. It was a ship ready to fly." The ethics of that choice tore through the workshop. A static test fire would risk the restored foil, the irreplaceable wiring, everything they had rebuilt. If the engine cracked or a fuel line burst, they would lose an artifact that should be behind museum glass. But if they succeeded, they would rewrite the history of a lost spacecraft and give Kelly's silent preservation its rightful ending. Joshua looked at the lander, the gold foil gleaming under his work lights, and made the call. They would fire the engine. Kenneth spent 3 days rechecking valve seats and welding in modern pressure transducers. Joshua sourced a small quantity of nitrogen tetroxide and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine from an aerospace supplier who didn't ask questions. The team constructed a blast shield from scrap steel and mounted cameras behind polycarbonate panels. Everyone in that workshop knew the next 60 seconds would either be the greatest moment of their lives or the loudest failure they'd ever hear. Joshua pressed the ignition sequence override. The fuel pumps began their low whine. The whine rose to a shriek, and then a cone of orange-white flame erupted from the descent engine bell. The workshop shook. The steel blast shield glowed faint red at the edges. For 5 long seconds, the gold-wrapped lander stood bathed in its own fire, exactly as it would have above the moon's surface 50 years ago. The cameras captured every frame. Joshua held his breath until the automated cutoff killed the fuel flow, and silence crashed back into the room. Kenneth was the first to speak. 100% thrust. Zero chamber anomaly. She flew right here on the ground. The data log showed a clean burn pattern, no pressure spikes, no thermal runaway. The engine that had been declared scrap in 1972 had just proven it could have landed on the moon. But the final surprise was still waiting. While cleaning the ascent stage hatch after the test, Joshua's team found a second hidden compartment behind the pilot's headrest. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook. It belonged to Thomas Kelly. The last entry, dated December 7, 1972, was a note to his infant daughter. By the time you read this, you'll know that your father helped save a piece of the moon. Some things are too important to let go. Kelly had passed away in 2009 without ever telling his family what he'd done. His daughter, now in her 50s, learned about the lander when Joshua tracked her down. She arrived at the workshop on a quiet Saturday morning, touched the gold foil her father had preserved, and said simply, he kept his promise. Joshua didn't sell the lander. He loaned it to a museum with one condition: the plaque must read, "Saved by the engineers who built it." Next to the serial plate, they mounted Kelly's notebook, open to that final page. And that's where the story takes its deepest turn. The Smithsonian cross-referenced the LM-14-X serial with their own archives and confirmed that this lander, had Apollo 19 flown, would have been the ship that carried the first geologists to the moon. A mission that never happened, a crew that never walked, but the machine that would have taken them survived because a handful of NASA engineers decided that history wasn't theirs to destroy. Joshua's $7,000 gamble didn't just restore a relic. It restored a lost chapter of human exploration. The question now is, how many other pieces of history are still out there, quietly forgotten in warehouses and basements, waiting for someone to look twice? Joshua's lander was one of a kind, but the impulse that saved it, that quiet belief that some things are too important to let go, lives in every workshop, every garage, every back room where a dusty artifact sits unrecognized. The engineers who hid this ship never lived to see it fire, yet their choice echoes louder than any launch. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. And if you want to see more incredible discoveries like this, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.